George woke up with a comfortable feeling. Several days had passed since he first arrived in the Indian village, and they had been days of fun and new experiences. Every day he went fishing in the big lake with some Indian boys about his age. Sometimes he galloped Nico around the lake shore. He spent long hours watching squaws tan deer in coon hides and sew them together. And when he grew tired of that, he would explore the huge village, getting acquainted with its many paths and the layouts of the wigwams. But best of all, for the first time in weeks, he went to bed with a full stomach, slept soundly at night, and woke up mornings feeling warm and snug on a pile of soft skins and covered with thick Indian blankets. Now he jumped up, gathered his new buckskin clothes, and hurried to a stream that ran near the rear of the wigwam he shared with Big Wolf. He washed quickly, for the early morning air chilled him and the water felt colder yet. Returning from the stream and feeling fresh and clean, he spotted Inwa tussling happily with a large brown and white spotted dog. Dog towered above the little girl, but he seemed friendly and obviously didn't mind when she hugged him, pulled at his tail, or rolled with him on the ground. "It is the little girl," George whispered. "Inwa." He had grown fond of this child in a few days he had known her. At first Inwa had been shy, but she was not any more. Just the day before, when he had stooped down to take a stone from his moccasin, she had jumped onto his back quick as a flash. She threw her arms tightly around his neck, and he had run with her around the village, the two of them laughing, and the squaws they passed nodded their heads in approval. "I'll see if she wants another ride," George thought. But as he drew near the little girl, something unexpected happened. The dog stopped playing with Inwa and turned to face George. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he growled threateningly, showing his big teeth. Now the dog crouched between Inwa and George. A low, snarling growl rumbled in his throat. "Do not move closer if you want to stay alive," a voice said from behind George. It was an Indian brave who lived in a nearby wigwam, but the brave did not seem to know what to do about the angry dog. Inwa and her old squaw ran to the dog, both of them scolding him at once. The dog stopped growling, and George moved closer. Now the dog knew George was a friend, and George joined Inwa in playing with the big animal. After that, George had a new friend. The dog often followed him around the village and seemed to feel that he must take care of George just as he guarded Inwa. Later that morning, as George watched some squaws work with deer hides, Big Wolf appeared beside him. Since George seldom saw the chief except during meals and sometimes in the early morning, he felt surprised at this appearance. "Come with me," Big Wolf commanded, and George followed. They walked along winding village paths until they came to the big oval arena where George had seen young Indians playing that first day in the village. Boys of all ages ran, jumped, wrestled, and played in the oval today as they had then. Big Wolf sat down on a log and watched, and George did the same. He watched the other boys raced, jumped, wrestled, and boxed. Sometimes he burst out laughing at the clever tactics the boys used in getting the best of their opponents. The chief seemed pleased with George, and George forgot himself completely while watching the two nearby wrestlers. He judged them to be about his age. "Why, that doesn't look hard," he thought. "Kinda looks like fun. I bet I could even teach them a thing or two." The next thing George knew, Two hands pushed him roughly from behind, and he was sent sprawling, face down in the dusty oval. He turned over and struggled to stand up. A moccasined foot struck against his chest, and he again fell to the ground. So hard this time that bits of sand ground into the palm of his hands. Surprised and angered, George sprang up and found himself facing one of the boys he had been fishing with earlier in the morning. The boy squatted down, ready to lunge at George again, his bold, bronze arms seesawing from tough, sturdy shoulders. Boy, of all the nerve, George thought, to attack me from behind. Well, I guess I'll teach him a good lesson he'll never forget. George sprang at the young Indian's face, but the Indian stepped lightly aside, and for the third time, George found himself flat on the ground. When he turned around, the Indian boy watched him closely, making no moves until George moved. George leaped toward the Indian again, and in the next few minutes learned that he was no match for this fighter. The Indian twisted around, avoiding most of George's thrusts, but managing to make all of his own find George. George began to feel sure that the Indian had as many legs as a spider. The air seemed full of them, and of slashing arms and pounding fists. Now George felt wet blood trickling from a cut on his face, and his lip felt as big as one of his ears. He felt like crying and running from this tough Indian, but then he remembered his father's warnings. If you should ever run afoul of the Indians, don't act scared. Do you hear me? Never, never show fear. So George continued to fight the Indian until he felt he could take no more. Then he just stepped back and folded his hands on his chest. The other boy stepped back too. The Indian smiled at him, and George returned the smile, though it was a crooked smile and hurt a little. George remembered Big Wolf and turned around, found the chief watching him. He also had a grim smile on his face. Big Wolf said a few low words, and the boys who had gathered to watch scattered immediately. George stood still a few minutes, ashamed that Big Wolf had seen him beaten. Then he began to feel angry with himself. He quickly turned and walked away. He strode to the lake and washed his face and hands, holding the cold water to his eyes, nose, and mouth. Then he sat down on a log to think things over. George tried to excuse himself. He caught me when I wasn't looking, but he knew that was not all. The boy's fists had been like steel, and he had danced and swerved to dodge every returned blow. The Indian knew how to fight. The thing for me to do is to practice jumping and running and wrestling like the other boys do, he thought. Then I'll show them I'm as tough as they are, and I'll start learning right away. Now the thought came to George that Big Wolf must have planned this match just to show George how much training he needed. He determined to practice and exercise so the Big Wolf could feel proud of his adopted boy. The afternoon sun shone high in the sky, though a cold wind whipped the air. But still, George continued to sit on the log and think. First, he thought about his friend Robert, and George understood more than ever why Pa had reared him to be a man and not to give in to pain and discomfort. I guess Robert's mother didn't know that by pampering and babying him, she was really doing him harm, George thought. If she had known, she would have almost died herself. Then George began to think of his own ma and pa, and wished with all his heart to be home again in his nice, comfortable settlement, where a boy didn't have to worry about being a great wrestler or jumper. He wondered why he had to be separated from ma and pa, and why people had to suffer and even die, though they were good people. All at once, George wondered why God had let this unhappiness come to him. He had been good. He had prayed, read sometimes from the big family Bible, and even gone every week to church when he lived in Germantown. What was it Pa had always said about suffering? He said never to question God when things go wrong. God doesn't cause the suffering, Pa had said, but when things do go wrong, He does help us endure, and He has to promised a great reward if we live right and keep our faith. I will, George said loudly into the forest, and a little gray squirrel sitting nearby cocked his head to listen. I will keep my faith in God. I won't forget that He loves me, no matter what happens. After all, there's a lot of children who have faced worse problems than I have. Now George was speaking so loudly that the squirrel grew frightened and ran away. When George realized he had been talking out loud, he sat back down on the log, feeling rather foolish and thinking quietly. But I haven't talked very much to God lately, he admitted. I guess I've done too much worrying and not enough praying. George resolved then and there that he would pray often for God's help, and he felt sure that God would find some way to help him. Even though it seems impossible now that I could ever escape from here, I know God will somehow help me find a way to get back home to my settlement. Then George spotted Big Wolf coming toward him through the forest. The big Indian looked tall and strong and kind. He walked proudly and held his mouth in a firm, straight line, but his black eyes showed concern for the boy sitting on the log. Big Wolf has been good to me, George thought. I must be good and obedient to him as long as I remain in this village. I must make him proud of me. I will obey him just so he never asks me to do something mean or wicked. Big Wolf sat down on the log beside George. The forest looks pretty now with the colored leaves. Soon it will be filled with snow, and ice will cover the tree branches like the clear glass I have seen used for windows. George did not know what to say, or so he said nothing. Big Wolf turned to face George and passed his rough hand gently over George's battered face. The eyes are turning black, Big Wolf said. Come, follow me. George followed Big Wolf to their wigwam, and the chief tied a piece of fresh venison to George's swollen eyes. The meat felt cool, and George lay back to rest. A short time later, the old squaw called George to the campfire outside. Rich, savory smells came from the pot she was stirring, and George suddenly felt very hungry. But when the squaw handed him a bowl of meat and vegetables, George found that he could not open his mouth wide enough to get the food inside. The squaw reached to take the bowl from him. But I'm hungry, George protested. Big Wolf looked amused. Give her the bowl, he said, and she will give you something that is easier to eat. The trouble is that the stomach does not know when the mouth is sore. Even George had to laugh at that. Little Inwa came and cuddled next to him, reaching her hands lightly to his bruised lips. Tears stood in her pretty eyes. George gratefully drank a bowl of broth, and he was surprised at how much better the warm liquid made him feel. After supper, George limped to his wigwam and tried to sleep. The squaw came with a poultice of pounded leaves for his lip. At first, George yelled from the sting, but the squaw stubbornly continued to apply it. He found that the poultice soon soothed the pain, and within a few minutes he was fast asleep.